I sometimes think the strangeness began with the toaster, though there are moments, if I dig far enough back, that suggest the seeds were planted earlier. Still, the toaster was the first moment I felt the quiet ripple of something not quite right. When we first started living together, breakfast was an oddly ceremonial part of the morning. The air in the kitchen would be cool, the windows slightly open even in winter, letting in a faint metallic scent from the street. I would drop slices of bread into the toaster, waiting for that gentle pop and the faint scent of browning crust. It felt like one of those simple pleasures that existed outside the chaos of everything else. But for him, there seemed to be rules about the process. The toaster dial was always set to its lowest point. The bread emerged almost exactly as it had entered, pale, limp, the butter beating on the surface instead of melting. At first, I thought it was just a personal preference. People like odd things all the time, and in the grand hierarchy of relationship compromises, bread color seemed like a negligible battle. It was only later that I noticed his silent monitoring. If I lingered near the toaster for too long, he would appear in the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching the red glow inside the slots. If my hand so much as hovered near the dial, his gaze would follow it until I withdrew. The rainy Sunday morning stands out. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and the sharp edge of wet air. He was upstairs in the shower. I decided to prepare breakfast: eggs, coffee, and bread that, for once, I wanted golden brown. My fingers turned the dial to a higher setting without hesitation. I stirred the eggs, the faint hiss of butter in the pan filling the silence, and heard the toaster pop. I turned and saw the bread, perfectly browned, almost glowing against the gray light from the window. I remember feeling an almost absurd pride, as if I had accomplished something daring. The next moments unfolded with a kind of slow inevitability. Footsteps in the hallway, the humid heat from the shower still clinging to the air, a pause near the counter, a hand reaching forward, pulling the plug from the socket. The slices lifted, carried to the window. Outside, the rain gathered in silver beads on the glass. The bread was released into the wet air, vanishing from sight. There was no explanation offered, no acknowledgement of the act itself. The toaster was returned to its place. The kitchen was left in silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the cooling stovetop. Later, he returned with flowers, as if nothing had occurred. Breakfast was eaten, with pale bread and a calm that felt almost rehearsed. The moment passed without discussion, yet it settled somewhere deep inside me, the recognition that there were rules here, unwritten but absolute. Rules I hadn't agreed to, but would somehow be expected to follow. That was the first time I understood that our mornings were not mine to shape. They belonged to something else, a pattern, a structure known only to him, and I was merely living inside it. The discovery happened on an afternoon that was otherwise forgettable, the kind of day that dissolves into a gray blur if not for one jarring detail. I had been looking for a recipe in the Notes app on his phone, something we'd made together months ago and had both liked. He had handed me the device without hesitation, scrolling already open to the app, his attention elsewhere. I should have typed the name of the dish into the search bar and been done with it. Instead, my eyes caught on a file with a plain, unremarkable title, List of Violations. At first, it sounded like something bureaucratic, a leftover from work, or some kind of private joke. But curiosity has its own gravity. I tapped it open. The entries were neat, methodical. Each one dated, each one describing an event in the same neutral tone. They began in January, with a note about leaving a cup on the table without a coaster. A week later, another, exhaling audibly while he told a story. Then, standing in the wrong place in the hallway when he was walking through. The language was stripped of emotion, like a clinical log. No adjectives, no explanations, only actions and dates, sometimes precise down to the minute. I scrolled further. They were all about me. The feeling was not like being caught, but like realizing you had been caught long ago without knowing it, and that the trial had already happened in your absence. I thought of mornings at the kitchen table, of evenings when he would look at me for a moment too long without speaking. I thought of the way he seemed to remember the smallest, most fleeting things. Now I saw them here, in a hidden archive, pinned to exact days and times. I closed the file quickly, though there was no sound in the house but the faint hum of the refrigerator. The weight of the phone in my hand felt heavier. That night, the awareness of the list followed me like a shadow. Every movement became deliberate. When I reached for a glass, I checked the counter twice before setting it down. When I walked through the hallway, I stayed pressed to the wall, as if the wrong trajectory might produce another entry. The walls of the house seemed to tighten, not in their physical shape, but in the knowledge that every gesture might be recorded somewhere unseen. The days after the discovery blurred together, yet the awareness never left. I began to imagine the pages growing longer in my absence. The idea of the list became more oppressive than the list itself, its invisible growth, the possibility that the record stretched further back than I could guess. I didn't open the file again. I didn't need to. Its existence was enough to alter the air of the house, to make me feel that I was living inside a document still being written. The chair had always been in the corner of the dining room. When we first moved in, it was just another piece of furniture, an armchair with faded upholstery and a faint smell of dust that no amount of cleaning seemed to remove. It faced the wall, angled slightly away from the table, as if it had been placed there in haste and forgotten. We never sat in it. Guests never did either. It was a piece meant to be seen but not used, like a relic from a time when the house belonged to someone else. On that particular evening, the light outside had already begun to sink into a muddy blue. Dinner was ready, the plates set, steam curling up in soft spirals. But instead of taking his usual place at the head of the table, he paused behind my chair. His hand rested briefly on the back, not in a gesture of affection but of quiet instruction. Without a word, I understood that my seat was elsewhere. The silent chair waited. The air in the dining room was heavier there, as though it had been undisturbed for too long. When I lowered myself into it, the cushion gave with a slow sigh, releasing a smell that was somehow colder than the rest of the room. The wall in front of me was bare, no paintings, no shelves, nothing to rest the eyes on except the uneven texture of the paint. From the table behind me came the faint sounds of cutlery against porcelain, the rhythmic scrape and pause of a meal being eaten at an unhurried pace. I could not see him, but I knew he was there, perfectly upright, the arc of his movements precise. The silence was not empty. It was layered, with the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant rush of cars on the wet street, the faint creak of the chair as I shifted my weight. The space between each sound seemed too long, stretching time until it felt viscous, like something you could sink into and not come out of. Minutes passed without any signal that I should move. The food in front of me cooled, untouched. My back began to ache from sitting so still, my hands resting in my lap as if their movement might disturb whatever balance the room demanded. The chair seemed to absorb more than just weight. It held my stillness, my caution, my unwillingness to break the rules that had never been spoken aloud. The bare wall became a kind of mirror, not reflecting my image, but showing me the outline of the space I occupied in the house, peripheral, turned away from the center. Eventually, the clink of cutlery stopped. The chair behind me scraped against the floor. There was the sound of a plate being lifted, footsteps retreating toward the kitchen. No call for me to follow, no glance to see if I had finished. I stayed in the silent chair until the sound of running water in the sink reached me. Only then did I stand, the cushion beneath me rising slowly, reclaiming its shape. The air felt no lighter. The chair remained in its place, facing the wall. It had no reason to move. The change was so small at first that it almost slipped past me. The clocks had always been the background rhythm of the house, their soft, steady ticking more like a texture than a sound. They belonged to the periphery, much like the hum of the fridge or the faint whisper of air moving through the vents. I didn't notice them until they were wrong. It began in the kitchen. The wall clock above the pantry was not in its usual place on the minute hand. It was off by a fraction, 17 minutes ahead of what my body thought the time should be. I assumed it was a battery issue, the sort of slow drift that happens without malice. But when I checked my phone, the difference was real. Then I moved through the house and realized it was not just the kitchen. The clock in the hallway, the one with the heavy brass frame, was 17 minutes fast. So was the small silver clock on the bedside table. Even the oven display, digital and steady for years, showed the same skewed time. The only object untouched was my wristwatch, which I had left on the dresser the night before. I felt a peculiar tension in my chest, as though something was now moving under my skin instead of in the world around me. The air in the rooms felt thicker, slower, though the clocks themselves had accelerated. For the rest of the day, I existed into parallel times. The official time of the house forward, insistent, and the stubborn, unseen time outside it, marked by my watch and the faint knowledge of how long shadows should be. When I boiled water for tea, I found myself misjudging the moment to remove it from the heat. When I looked out the window, the position of the sun contradicted the numbers in the kitchen. As the days passed, the 17 minutes became more than an offset. They became a gap, an unfilled space between two realities. In the house's time, I was always just ahead of myself, moving through events before they were ready to occur. Meals were served before hunger arrived. Lights were switched on while there was still enough daylight. The world outside the windows felt late, unresponsive, dragging its feet while the inside of the house marched on. At night, I would wake without knowing which time had called me back from sleep. The bedside clock's glowing digits told me one story, the slow, invisible clock in my body told me another. Sometimes I would lie there for what felt like minutes, but when I looked again, nearly half an hour had passed in-house time. I began to wonder if the 17 minutes had always existed, hidden beneath my notice, and he had only brought them to the surface. I thought of the lists. I thought of the silent chair. Each had rearranged the shape of my days in ways I had not agreed to, yet accepted. Now the clocks were the same, an unspoken arrangement, a rule I had never been invited to question. When I stepped outside, the shift was immediate. The air seemed sharper, the light truer. The clocks of the outside world, in shop windows, on phone screens, aligned perfectly with the weight of the sun overhead. For a few moments, I could breathe without the strange pressure that filled the house. Returning home felt like stepping into a current moving faster than my own. The ticking of the kitchen clock was louder than I remembered, as though it was announcing its difference. I would catch myself glancing at it without intention, the way you might check a wound you know is still there. In the end, I stopped wearing my watch. Without it, the house's time became the only time. Days still felt strange, stretched in places, compressed in others, but there was no longer a reference point to measure against. The 17 minutes disappeared in plain sight, swallowed by the rhythm of the walls. The clocks still lead me forward. I no longer know where. It began with the feeling that something in the house had shifted. At first, I thought it was only in my head, the faint sense that the bedroom door was now a little closer to the corner than before, that the hallway stretched a fraction longer at night. I blamed the clocks, the lists, the chair. I told myself perception is slippery, but then I noticed the guest room. It was always the smallest room in the house, tucked at the far end of the upstairs hallway. Its window overlooked the streetlight, which gave the walls a weak orange glow at night. One morning, while changing the sheets, I realized the window no longer aligned with the radiator beneath it. The gap between them had grown wider. In the days that followed, the changes became impossible to ignore. The doorframe in the study leaned at a slightly different angle. The light switch in the bathroom was half an inch higher than I remembered. The pictures on the walls had shifted positions without being taken down. There was never a sound of movement, no creak of wood, no grinding of nails. The changes happened in silence, and only when I wasn't looking. The house rearranged itself in increments, like the slow erosion of a coastline, obvious only when compared to a memory. Walking from one room to another became an exercise in doubt. I would stop in the hallway, trying to recall the exact position of the runner rug, the pattern of the shadows on the floorboards. By the time I convinced myself something was different, the certainty would dissolve into uncertainty. The moving was not random. The changes seemed to guide the paths through the house, narrowing some spaces while opening others. The silent chair's corner became tighter, the space between it and the wall shrinking until it could no longer be approached without turning sideways. Meanwhile, the kitchen doorway widened, as if inviting a swifter passage. One evening, I realized the guest room had nearly vanished. What had once been a narrow but functional space was now little more than a sliver between two walls. The bed frame was gone, replaced by a chair that didn't belong to us. The window had shifted so far to the right that it cut into the plaster. The room wasn't just moving, it was being erased. It happened gradually, the way light fades before night. Over weeks, the angles it wasn't only a visual change. The absence of corners altered the way sound moved. Footsteps didn't bounce as sharply against the walls. Voices, when there were any, no longer seemed to echo. Everything was muffled, as if padded. Without corners, the rooms began to feel endless. My eyes searched for the boundaries, but they were gone, replaced by a continuous, looping sense of space. It became harder to tell where one wall ended and another began. The lists still existed. The clocks still kept their 17-minute lead. The silent chair still faced the wall, but now the structure holding them all together was dissolving. It was as though the house no longer wanted to contain me in discrete spaces. It wanted to fold me into something without shape. I began to lose track of where I was within it. A hallway would lead into a room I didn't remember entering. A turn toward the kitchen would open into the upstairs landing. I stopped trying to correct my route. The paths were no longer mine to choose. At night, I would wake and stare into the dark, searching for the familiar outline of the bedroom door. It was never in the same place twice. Sometimes it was gone altogether, replaced by a seamless stretch of wall. When that happened, I stayed in bed until daylight, not daring to move. Eventually, the corners in my memory began to fade too. I tried to picture the square of the kitchen window, the rectangular frame of the bathroom mirror, the right angles of the dining table, but they blurred into soft, unmeasured curves. I don't know if the house is changing to match him, or if I am.